My name is Denny Clark, and I've been teaching religious studies for over 35 years. And I'm very glad to be able to be with you here this evening and during uh, four sessions total over the next 6 weeks here. And we're going to be dealing with the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is a gospel that I have been absolutely fascinated by for the last 50 years. Have spent a good deal of time dealing with that. And as we go through this series, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things that I've noticed as I've been looking at this, but I'm mostly interested in your encountering the Gospel of Mark and being able to see things that perhaps you have never seen before in relationship to that. We have a goofy schedule, really goofy. I apologize for the really late announcement that came out today. It was supposed to come out a month ago. And we've had some intimations of what has been occurring, but rest assured, I do not expect that you have all read the Gospel of Mark prior to this evening. But we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But we're going to be meeting on September 4th, 11th. Then there's another event that is occurring in this room on the 18th. We'll be back here for the 25th. Another event here on October 2nd, and then we'll wrap up on October 9th. So it's an odd kind of series, but that's what we've got to deal with. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest of the four New Testament Gospels to have been written. Mark invented something new. Prior to Mark writing a narrative gospel, okay, a continuous kind of story, there were basically individual snippets that were shared. They would be used within sermons. They'd be used in conversations. Somebody might say, Jesus once said such and such, but there was no storyline that was with it. There were certainly some collections of sayings of a particular type, or perhaps stories of a particular type. Perhaps collections of miracle materials. Perhaps collections of parables. Collections of stories that were doing one particular kind of thing. But Mark is the first one to have put together a continuous story of Jesus. So being the earliest, that's certainly worthwhile to pay attention to in terms of going through and causing us to look at this particular material. But it also becomes very important because of how it was subsequently used. It was not an oddball enough thing for somebody else to do just their own thing. Instead, other gospel writers, all three of the other gospel writers in the New Testament, used the Gospel of Mark as a source for their own gospel, their own gospels. They used it in different ways. Matthew and Luke used it rather closely and followed Mark's sequence really quite closely in most respects. The Gospel of John, not so much. In the Gospel of John, it becomes clear in certain passages that yes, John is familiar with this material, but John does not follow Mark's story nearly as closely as Matthew and Luke do. Now, when we talk about the gospel according to Mark, you'll notice throughout the slides, I'm usually going to just use the abbreviation MK. And I'm doing that for a particular reason. In many respects, it's really problematic to think about the gospel according to Mark as though there is somebody named Mark who wrote it. Frankly, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. We don't know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. We do not know who wrote the Gospel of Luke. We do not know who wrote the Gospel of John. All of these writings are anonymous. And one other thing, though, even though we can't say who it was that wrote these materials, we can say something that the author is not. The author of the gospel, according to Mark, is not an eyewitness of the events that is being talked about, nor is the author of the Gospel of Matthew, nor is the author of the Gospel of Luke, nor is the author of the Gospel of John. So that's something that really isn't an odd feature for Mark, although when we ask the question, who wrote the Gospel according to Mark? It sounds a bit like who's buried in Grant's tomb. It sounds like an obvious kind of answer, but it really isn't. We do not know who he or she was. And that is not saying he or she here is not a nice modern kind of nicety to say. It is something that is a genuine issue. And there are a number of things in the Gospel of Mark that have caused some very, very good New Testament scholars to say, gee, did a woman write this? And I think there's much to be said for that. But we know that it wasn't by an eyewitness. One of the reasons we know it's not by an eyewitness is that never does it claim to be by an eyewitness. Now, a lot of times when people do study of a particular gospel, they'll start with an assumption about the author and assume that, well, somehow there's this guy named Mark, and very often there are attempts to specify who that guy was. There are traditions in the 2nd century that make particular claims. But when we look at those claims, we find that what those 2nd century sources are saying are frankly at odds with what we actually read in the gospel. For example, a very famous attribution of the Gospel of Mark was by a man named Papias. And Papias claimed that Mark was an associate of Peter, and in fact served as the translator, the interpreter for Peter, and goes through this whole process saying that Mark recorded what Peter said, but not in order. A very, very odd kind of thing to say. Not in order. Now, as we're going to see as we go through the Gospel of Mark, there are real problems saying that the source of this material is from someone who is closely associated with Peter, and that it's basically passing on Peter's teachings. Why? Because in the Gospel of Mark, the 12, including Peter, get ripped up one side and down the other. Peter is one of the really negative characters in the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to find that, when the Gospel of Matthew redoes Mark's story, Matthew is going to rehabilitate Peter considerably. And Luke is going to do the same thing, but in a different way. Matthew and Luke both present Peter in a more positive light, but they do so differently, meaning they do so independently. That's their own take on Mark's story. They're both upset by what Mark had done with that. But if we spend a lot of time trying to focus on the author for the Gospel of Mark, we're barking up the wrong tree in terms of trying to understand what Mark is doing. And again, I'm using the term Mark, regardless of who she or he may have been. It's just a shorthand term for the author. But with this, the author of this material does not think it's important for the audience to know who wrote it, because it's never included. So if we end up saying, you've got to pay attention to this being a particular person, we're automatically undercutting what this story of Jesus is about. Second reason why we know that this is not by an eyewitness. The Gospel of Mark, and what I'm saying here also applies to the other Gospels too, but the Gospel of Mark is not written the way we would expect an eyewitness to write. For example, never in any of these Gospels, but we're talking about Mark right now, never in Mark do we ever find the author say, I heard Jesus say such and such, or we went to such and such a location. He told us to do such and such a thing. Never is such a thing included. There's no indication that the author was present at all. Third reason why we can be pretty sure that the author of the Gospel of Mark is not an eyewitness. Very often, Mark will talk about what Jesus is thinking, or what somebody else is thinking, or talks about events that occur in two different places at the same time. Now, we're accustomed in watching films, watching TV. Okay, it's easy to have cameras zoom in on someone on one side of the city, sitting alone in her apartment and looking at a bottle of pills. But then the scene shifts to her family. The family worried about where she could be. She's not answering the phone. We can go back and forth like that in a story. But no, you can't do that in a first person kind of, or in an eyewitness sort of narrative. There are a number of things in which Jesus is by himself praying. And we hear what Jesus says. And the emphasis is that he's alone. Nobody else is there. But, the author is able to share this. Now, in literature, this is called an omniscient narrator. And we find that this is standard kind of way of writing any kind of fictional work. You will often find people who are even writing histories who will try recreating what they think was being said, but no, it's not eyewitness testimony that they're presenting at that time. But anyway, eyewitness is not really part of what we're looking at when we're dealing with the Gospel of Mark. Questions about that? And by the way, through this, if you ever have a question about something or a real strenuous objection, or even a minor objection to something that I say, don't hesitate to interrupt me, and we'll get those kinds of things taken care of. Any questions? All right. We're going to focus in this series on story. Mark's story of Jesus. A story has a beginning, a story has an ending, and something happens in between those two. And the story generally does not go in just one nice, neat direction. It goes in multiple directions. It switches directions very frequently. The interactions during this storyline, the interactions of various characters with one another and with the circumstances presented in the story, are what we all term as plot. The story unfolds gradually, bit by bit, in sequence. There are no shortcuts. Now, this is especially the case with this piece of ancient literature. The literacy rate in the Greco-Roman world was less than 10%. And writing materials were frightfully expensive. Most materials were written in order to be spoken aloud to a group. And if you happen to be sitting in the audience and you're hearing a story unfold, you don't get the opportunity to stop and flip back a few pages, check something else. No, the story just keeps going along. And the story itself makes an impression on people. One of the key aspects of story is that readers get involved with the story. Today in our culture, film, whether on TV and theaters, film is probably the best example of getting involved in that. When I'm watching a particular film, particular movie, there are times that I can feel my heartbeat going faster. There are times that, I can feel my eyes watering up and a tear will run down my face. Now, up here, I know that that's a group of actors who are going through the process. But in the process of entering a story, we just kind of set all that aside. And we involve ourselves in the lives of those characters. We we simply immerse ourselves in that world. In things as simple as the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Okay, we put aside our uh, rational objections that, oh, bears don't live in houses, uh, uh, they don't sit in chairs, they don't sleep in beds, but, oh, the story requires us to deal with it. So, oh, we just step into the story world, we go along with what's going on there, and, oh, we experience a particular kind of meaning as we deal with that. But in the unfolding of a story, you really don't know where you're going. You don't know normally what the ending is going to be. Murder mysteries really depend heavily on this. In most murder mysteries, by page 5, okay, you've already seen the crime. And you may have thought, oh, I know who did it. Well, on page 5 of a 300-page book, no, you don't. But, oh, from the information, the details that are presented, we as readers, we as the audience of a story, start making assumptions. We take the stuff that we see and we put it together so that it makes sense to us. And we follow there and follow along with that. And at certain points, we say, yep, hey, I told you, that's what's going on. And then you get to a point where, whoop, there's this sudden shift. And no, that can't be the case. In which case, you have to kind of back up your whole set of assumptions, go back to thinking, what did I miss? Okay, and sure enough, you'll go down another blind alley with a good author. But story is something that we develop an understanding of the story. We develop the meaning of a story gradually over time. Now, every story, including stories such as the Gospel of Mark, involves selection. And the material is selected for a particular purpose. Now, think how incredible a gospel is. The Gospel of Mark can be read aloud within roughly an hour and a half. If you aren't reading aloud, you can read it faster. But imagine telling not just the life of a person, but the significance of a person. Summing it all up in less than an hour and a half. That's a crazy kind of thing. No, it doesn't tell us everything about Jesus. No, it doesn't tell things in an exact unfolding of what really happened. To just shift gospels for a moment, in the Gospel of Matthew, the so-called Sermon on the Mount, if we watch what Matthew has done in creating that, Matthew has taken materials from various places and has pulled them together into one spot because, hey, in the 2 hours and 15 minutes it takes to read the Gospel of Matthew, okay, you don't have time to say, well, Jesus said this in this kind of location, then he traveled over there and he said something else over there. No, you pull it all together and you have him present this pile of teaching in one spot. Matthew created the Sermon on the Mount, drawing from various places. It's an efficient way of presenting a significant collection of what Jesus supposedly was teaching. Mark does the same kind of thing, selecting various things. We don't know what Jesus had for breakfast. We don't know what kind of toothpaste he used. There are all sorts of things that we don't know from these Gospels, but the material is selected in order to make a particular point, present a particular view of what Jesus was about. So, when we're trying to understand what Mark is doing, we are going to completely defeat the purpose if we are reading along and, oh, there's something that we saw in a very similar story to this from some other gospel, and we end up saying, oh, that's what's going on, and we pull that detail in from the Gospel of Luke. No. As soon as you pull something in from another gospel, you've changed Mark's story. It's no longer doing what Mark was trying to get across. It's messing up Mark's focus at that point. It's really very, very important to be paying attention to Mark's own story. In the plot line up there, you will see various gaps. It's not a continuous line. Every story has gaps. And gaps are an absolutely necessary feature in a story. Gaps, are things where, no, the author does not tell us everything that's going on there. The author says something and then says something else. And we, the reader, we, the audience, end up making assumptions of what goes there. That's why we go down blind alleys in trying to understand things. We have put together things in a particular way. We've gone down there. The gaps allow us as an audience to be involved. It allows us to interact with the material, to wrestle with the material in terms of what's occurring. So the gaps are not a flaw in this material. The gaps are an absolutely crucial ingredient of the story. There are all sorts of expectations we have. And sometimes those expectations end up being fulfilled. Sometimes they don't. But our expectations are part of how the meaning of a story occurs. There are twists, there are reversals. All of that is part of encountering a story. Now, if we want to know what a story is emphasizing, we watch for repetitions. They're pieces of vocabulary that will crop up over and over again. Sometimes there are very similar incidents that occur. As attentive readers, we notice those things. We pick up on those things. Sometimes these dramatic shifts, usually those shifts occur at crucial moments in the story. And that becomes a key element in meaning formation. Sometimes there's foreshadowing. The Gospel of Mark uses this in many, many places, in which during the first half of Mark's Gospel, Jesus really seems to be this very powerful figure. And yet, there are rumblings that occur. People plotting to destroy him. Doesn't say much about that, but you hear that undercurrent. Sometimes there are flashbacks, and we are going to see a major flashback that occurs toward the end of Mark's gospel, in which something occurs recalling something that happened days earlier. And that becomes a really important thing for recognizing what's going on in that particular scene. So we understand the story through the interactions of all its elements, the interconnections that are there. And this is something where we, as people sitting in a pew on a Sunday morning, end up having really difficult problems. Most people have never encountered Mark's story of Jesus. In worship, we normally deal with a paragraph of material. And there is usually very little or no sense of a wider story. Sometimes the person preaching will make those connections, but a lot of times what's being emphasized is something that's just there in that story. You're looking at that one incident and not paying attention to what the gospel writer was doing with that. And very often, where the sermon goes is not where Mark would have gone, as we can see by those other kinds of connections that are there. We also lump gospels together, assuming that there is just one story of Jesus, namely what really happened, historically speaking, to Jesus, and that somehow all these gospel writers know that one story, and they're just sharing bits and pieces of that. And that's what enables us to, or gives us the rationalization to say, I can take this from some other gospel and I'll bring that in because that helps me understand the full story of Jesus. No, that helps you destroy Mark's story of Jesus. And it is not true that what the gospel writers are doing is all dealing with material that really happened. Often, that may be the case. Sometimes, that's not the case. Sometimes, gospel writers create things. And there are plenty of spots where we can watch that type of thing happen. But when we lump the stories together, we're basically avoiding Mark's story. There are 4 gospels in the New Testament. There are 4 different stories. And even particular terms are understood differently in Gospels. What Mark means by Jesus being Son of God is significantly different from what Matthew means by saying Jesus is Son of God, which is significantly different from what Luke says about Jesus being Son of God, which is really different from what the Gospel of John means by saying Jesus is Son of God. Same with the term Messiah or Christ. We have to pay attention to how each gospel writer's story fits together to understand what they're doing. We can't just take Matthew's meaning, plug it into Mark or into John, etc. We, in our encounter with a gospel, often read later theological understandings back into the story. And that goes with those terms like Son of God, for example. Very, very different kind of understanding. The things that have been assumed by much of Christianity about various theological understandings did not occur for another 300-400 years after the time the Gospels were written. And thus, when we say, I know what's going on, we're likely missing the boat. The lectionary. Now, here at Countryside, most of what occurs in terms of scripture readings on a Sunday morning come from something called the Revised Common Lectionary. Sometimes, for some very good reasons, the preacher will veer from that and pick up something else. But the lectionary really is not our friend in terms of understanding the Gospel of Mark. During this whole year, starting back in the beginning of Advent last year, the lectionary is supposedly dealing with the year of Mark, in which the Gospel of Mark is the primary gospel being used. However, up through the beginning of summer, less than half of the readings were from Mark. And most of the readings that were used were coming from the Gospel of John. And John has almost a diametrically opposed view of what's going on in terms of understanding Jesus from what Mark does. More recently, we have had Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday of Jesus, the bread of life, in terms of Sunday morning readings, which have been occurring from the Gospel of John. Just prior to going through all of that John material connected with the story of the feeding of the 5,000. The lectionary was at the point in Mark of dealing with the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But it didn't tell the story. It gave material prior to the feeding of the 5,000. It told what happened after the feeding of the 5,000, but it skipped over the material in between. And then we have John's very different understanding. We're going to spend time next week dealing with some of what Mark says about the feeding of the 5,000, and we'll see some major differences there. I'm going to invite you to be part of an experiment during these next few sessions. And I'm going to encourage you to read Mark's story of Jesus by itself. If you don't read it, you can't read it, you don't have time to read it, that's all right. I hope to see you back. But to understand what Mark is doing, it really helps to actually encounter what Mark says. I encourage you to read Mark's story, preferably aloud, starting at the beginning of Mark and ending at 16:8. Now you'll find that the Gospel of Mark has some more stuff that occurs after that. But if you look really closely in most modern translations, you will see a set of double brackets around this other material. Because in the earliest and best manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, the stuff after 16:8 was not present. It was added later. And it was added because of a problem that we will see at 16:8. But 16:8 is apparently where Mark intended to end the gospel. And it's a shocker. It's weird. As you read things, I ask you to watch for oddities. What seems weird there? I read rapidly, but if you read rapidly, okay, just because you recognize the beginning of a story, don't assume you know the whole thing that's going on. Read it through, but pay attention to the weird stuff that you encounter. Pay attention to what you expected to see, but don't see. Don't fill in details from other Gospels or from your own assumptions about who Jesus is. Pay attention to what Mark is emphasizing. And why might he or she have told the story in this particular way? For the rest of our time this evening, I'd like us to pay attention to the beginning and the ending. Now, ideally, you would have read through the whole thing, but paying attention to beginnings and endings after you've done the read through, okay, is really very, very important. And I'm going to read aloud the first 15 verses of the Gospel of Mark. You'll be able to see it on the screen. And I want you to be just watching for things that stand out to you, particular questions that get raised for you, and we'll do some sharing of those things as we continue on. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it's written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. And he proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the strap of his sandals. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with Holy Spirit." And in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately cast him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, tested by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels served him. Now, after John was handed over, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." What strikes you about this? What questions are raised by this? What expectations do you have when this is how the story begins? And with this, set aside everything that you have ever heard or read or thought about Jesus. We jump to the end. Jesus has been executed. Jesus has been buried. Something that, no, we really haven't been prepared for in terms of the start of Mark's gospel. And when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. And they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples, even Peter, that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. We'll obviously be coming back to this and trying to make sense of what's going on here. But I wanted you to see the ending because with this, that helps underscore that what we have normally thought about in terms of what gospels are about and what the grand finale of a gospel would be. No, not for Mark. The other gospels are all going to put something more on. One of the reasons that we know that this is where Mark ended, besides the fact that the earliest and best manuscripts stop at exactly this point, and the fact that, there were some other endings that got added on because somebody apparently didn't feel very comfortable with that. And those endings, there's a shorter ending and a longer ending. Sometimes it's just the shorter ending, sometimes just the longer ending, sometimes the shorter and the longer ending are included. But when we look at what Matthew and Luke are doing, we have Mark's story with a series of events in terms of Jesus' death leading to the end of Mark's gospel. Matthew and Luke both follow in lockstep. Sometimes they add a few things, sometimes they remove a few things, but they're basically following Mark's agenda until the equivalent point in their respective stories to Mark 16, verse 8. Matthew and Luke are going to continue, but boom, they go in completely opposite directions. Nothing after 16:8 agrees in these gospels. The endings that got tacked on to Mark's gospel They use a different type of vocabulary. They use a different style in Greek. I mean, nothing really fits in terms of them being part of the Gospel of Mark. I mean, it introduces new kinds of themes, just alien kind of materials. But yes, Mark seems to have ended there. And yes, Matthew thought that was problematic. Luke thought that was problematic. They fixed it. Those other endings tried to fix it. Mark, this is what Mark intended. And it's up to us to figure out, now why would Mark do that? What's going on here? We're going to stop at this point because our time is up. And for next session, if you're able, I'd encourage you to read through Gospel of Mark. If you can't, come back anyway. We'll fill you in. But as you go through this, we're going to be looking especially at the first half of Mark's Gospel. And we're going to see Mark's Gospel has a lot of miracle activity going on. I mean, one miracle after another. And it's going to be important to watch that. Why does Mark have all this miracle stuff here? And what does this say to the circumstance of Mark's audience? What should Mark's audience expect when things get rough? And does that happen? But we'll see most of these miracles are healings and exorcisms, but there are also a set of sea stories and a set of feedings. And I'd like you to pay attention to those and read them in sequence, because there are some shocking things about that raise questions about what is going on here. As we get into the second half of the gospel, starting at chapter 8, verse 22, this is basically material of Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. And Jesus is teaching his disciples. The material is structured in a particular way. There's a pattern that gets repeated over and over in this material. And it's particularly focused on, what does being a disciple, a follower of Jesus, mean? And pay attention to the 12. They're a sorry bunch. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Look forward to seeing you next round.